Paleozoic life forms that don't quite fit into modern phyla or modern classes. Many Paleozoic forms are puzzling in their taxonomy, and some consider them to be extinct classes of possibly sponges, or in some cases even extinct phyla. The Receptaculites is an example of this. Receptaculites and Ischadites are generally in older textbooks classified in the sponges, but they definitely are not sponges. They have been variously considered as being members of the calcareous algae. They've also been considered to be representatives of their own extinct phylum, but they definitely are not sponges. They do not have spicules. They do not have any of the morphologic or structural features that characterize the sponges. Another group that is definitely not a sponge are the archaeocyathids. The archaeocyathids are generally considered to be representatives of an extinct phylum. They're predominantly restricted to the Lower Cambrian, and they're a very distinctive fossil in Lower Cambrian limestones. They were also one of the first reef-forming organisms, other than the blue-green algae or the cyanobacteria. The archaeocyathids formed some of the very, very earliest known reefs. Chancelloria is presented in the sponge tape by Gil Norris as being a sponge, but it is very, very questioned as to whether it really is. The evidence seems to be that Chancelloria represents some extinct body plan of organism, possibly little plates that were covered the body of a kind of a fleshy organism, which was covered like a suit of mail by the little buttons that represent Chancelloria. And most workers have considered Chancelloria as definitely not a sponge. It belongs to one of these very, very problematic groups of fossils found at the very beginning of the Paleozoic era, a group of fossils called the Timoshian. And there are a number of other very, very strange organisms that appear in the Timoshian, which have no relationships to later organisms, not even organisms in the Cambrian. But Chancelloria continues into the Cambrian and occurs all the way into the Upper Cambrian, where it then goes extinct. This fossil you're seeing on the screen that looks like a coral is a peculiar thing that some have considered maybe a sponge. It's called Wapericonus, and it is found in limited areas only in New Zealand. And unlike most of the problematic fossils that you find in the rock record, Wapericonus is found in the Mesozoic. Most problematic and totally puzzling enigmas, paleontological enigmas, are found in the Lower Paleozoic, most of them in the Cambrian. Radiation event, or the appearance of Cambrian fossils in abundance, marked the beginning of life. When The Origin of Species was published, people realized that if evolution was true, that there should be a fossil record much earlier than that of the Cambrian. And people started to look and spend the necessary time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears that you have to spend to locate good fossils. And this occurrence of Eozoon canadense, this peculiar dome-like structure, was found in strata in Quebec. And there were those that said it was definitely a fossil. And they were in pretty good company. Charles Lyell, for one, considered it to be a bona fide fossil. Charles Darwin considered it to be. A number of late 19th century paleontologists considered it to be a bona fide, very, very early and very primitive life form. What they considered it to be was some type of giant foraminifera or giant protozoan, which they called a rhizopod. And it's not too far from that to go into the sponges, because sponges in many ways are simply a collection of protozoans put on a scaffolding, put on a spicule system or a skeleton. So there were those that said Eozoon was also a type of sponge. But the Eozoon question reigned throughout the last third of the 19th century, and by the early part of this century, the controversy kind of died down. The general view that prevailed in this century is that Eozoon is probably a pseudofossil, is a structure that looks like a fossil but isn't. At best, it might be some kind of a structure produced by blue-green algae, some type of what is called a stromatolite. The Eozoon controversy was exactly that, a major controversy in science in the last third of the 19th century. In the early part of this century, one of the main workers in quest of fossils older than those of the Cambrian was Charles Doolittle Walcott. Walcott was with the U.S. Geological Survey, and later, at the turn of the century, became director of the survey and then director of the Smithsonian Institute. And he spent most of his summers from the mid-1890s up to his death in 1927 chasing after Precambrian fossils. And one of the fossils that Walcott turned up was a structure that you see here, which he named Atticocania. And he considered it some type of a sponge or some type of an archaeocyathid. He found this in very, very old Precambrian rocks in an area called Steep Rock Lake in western Ontario. And the story is that he almost lost his life in finding this, that he fell out of the canoe and fell in very deep water with a heavy pair of bush boots on and had to be retrieved, and had difficulty getting him back into the canoe because these Atticocania to form reefs associated with stromatolites. Forms a series of clusters, these radial structures that you see here, associated with stromatolites. And it does suggest a sponge. Atticocania was considered by Walcott to be either a sponge or an archaeocyathid. And it was, at the time, the oldest fossil that was reported. It comes from the Archean, or the Archaeozoic, rock strata thousands and thousands and thousands of feet below even the ancient later Precambrian rocks, which occur thousands and thousands and thousands of feet below strata of the Cambrian age. Atticocania is considered today as probably a pseudofossil, a structure produced by gypsum needles, clusters of gypsum needles that grew in a hypersaline, shallow water marine environment. You can see on some specimens of Atticocania like this what look like stromatolite fingers growing between the gypsum needles, or the rays of Atticocania. It is another one of these enigmas that occurs in the Precambrian, occurs in these very, very ancient strata that make up some 80% of the history of the Earth.